Now, as the first European leader to visit China in 2017, how do you look at the significance of Prime Minister Cazeneuve's visit to China?
Well, I think it's supposed to be interpreted as France's great openness towards China, that is, towards the government, towards the economy, and it's supposed to be understood as a positive gesture. However, there is a context. The fact that it's Bernard Cazeneuve, for example, is something of a surprise. The Prime Minister before, Manuel Valls, would have been the person who would have made this visit in what would have been perhaps a midterm of a long session for President Hollande. And instead what we have is a man who was appointed Prime Minister in sort of on the rebound, while Manuel Valls presented himself for the presidency. So the individual personality, Cazeneuve, is sort of a late night appointment, but the intention in terms of foreign policy is to send a clear message to China that France wants to retain its strong relationship with China.
Mm-hmm. Now, due to the uncertainty caused by US President Donald Trump's election win and Brexit, do you think it's an opportunity, although it's a last-minute, late-night appointment, as you just mentioned, do you think it's an opportunity to develop a deeper Sino-French relationship?
Yes, and that is exactly the message that's being communicated. If the Prime Minister of France is traveling to China and making these visits, it's not really to inspect factories, but it's to send a message that this government of France is not protectionist. That is, the socialist government wants to distance itself from domestic politicians in France, like Marine Le Pen of the National Front, who's calling on a 3.5% tax on all imports on its right, or on its left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who wants to impose a carbon tax which would increase the cost of Chinese goods coming into France by the kilometer. So the current socialist government is sending a message to China, but it's also through intermestic politics sending a message back to France that trade with China is vital for the future of the French economy, and the real danger is protectionism.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we are going into the French election in 2 months' time, the question really is how big of a chance Marine Le Pen has in winning that election, and if she does win out in this round, in this election, what kind of challenges will it pose, you think, for China's relationship with France and with Europe in general?
The fears that right now are stirring the pot of ultranationalism in France, the fears sometimes take a Chinese face, sometimes they take an American face. But when the image of China coming into France being more wealthy, being a more dominant manufacturing country, having the ability to purchase emblematic French corporations like Accor Hotels or Club Med, when there's an image of China that can be caricaturized, Marine Le Pen can pursue policies that will in fact be destructive to France. So the idea of limiting Chinese investment out of the name of economic nationalism would in fact hurt French enterprises who desperately need more capital, which China is able to provide. The idea of imposing import taxes on China can only produce reciprocity. That is, the problem with imposing duties, with imposing tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, is eventually it's tit for tat. And in the end, everyone ends up paying for it. So the risk of Marine Le Pen coming to office for French-Chinese relations, economic relations, is grave. It's serious. Despite the fact that both countries would be pursuing nationalism, they would be pursuing nationalism that was domestically oriented. And I doubt that China would adopt a policy of France first.
No, and I don't know whether China would adopt that kind of a nationalist policy here. But let's talk more on the economic side. We noticed that Chinese Premier and French Prime Minister discussed cooperation in some new fields this time, such as P4 Biosafety Lab, which is the Class 4 Pathogens Biosafety Lab, and Eco-City project in Wuhan in central China. What do you think of these breakthroughs? Have you been paying attention to such development?
Yeah, one of the problems had been in the past, say 10, 20 years ago, had been the sense that there were barriers against foreign direct investment, and that France often would draw a red line when it came to national champions in aerospace or in sensitive industries. And there was a feeling in France that French investments were blocked by requiring Chinese partners. And I think when we get cooperation in state-of-the-art technologies, it brings things to a new level because it builds confidence. The partners soon come to see they can cooperate in sensitive issues, that the Chinese can be a trusted partner of France, and France can be a trusted partner of China. So I find this is very positive. Of course, these are small issues, they're the first steps, but ultimately what we want is a greater integration and internationalization of manufacturing and scientific processes, where each country offered its comparative advantage. And China has numerous comparative advantages that it can offer to France. And France also, with its high tech, its specialization, its high level of education, its leadership in areas like robotics, has things to offer to China as well. And building the trust is good. And I think that's what a politician visiting can do, can establish a symbolic relationship on top of
especially on
investment.
Especially on the momentum that has been built by the high frequency of exchanges of top leaders between these two countries. Finally, let's talk briefly about Africa, because that is one continent that both China pay a lot of attention to, and France, of course. We have seen that the local people seem to have been have been trying to compete which model they would prefer, and growingly the French statistics show that African people are preferring the Chinese model of development. Is there a kind of competition between China and France in Africa, or you think this increased cooperation between these two nations can also help boost China and France's cooperation with African countries?
Well, okay, I don't want to equivocate, but there are aspects of both of those answers which would be correct. Let me start again with the fear, because you have right now a populist sentiment in France which is leading to ultranationalism that's widespread. So there's a fear in France that China is entering into its Africa. So there's a part of the African continent which is French-speaking. These were former French colonies. And France, even after decolonization, continued to dominate economically, politically, militarily, diplomatically. And so this area, sometimes called France-Afrique, or French Africa, is now menaced. In this fear, it's menaced by China's entry. And there's a word being used now, Chine-Afrique, which is a meme on that notion.
China, Africa,
the idea that China will come in and take over. Now, that's a fear. Now, the real planners, however, see nothing but opportunity. French Africa is deeply underinvested. It has tremendous needs for capital, for the kind of infrastructural development that China can offer. And so the ones who are planners are trying to take advantage of the French-Chinese relations and use France as a platform for Chinese investment in Africa. France happens to have $212 billion in renminbi, in Chinese currency, and French corporations are willing to use this Chinese currency, count it for investment. And so France can become a safe place for investment with established financial markets, with large corporations, and in a way allowing China to pursue its adventure into Francophone Africa. I don't think they need France for Nigeria, for South Africa, for Ethiopia, for the Anglophone countries. But for Francophone Africa, I think France makes a cultural intermediary who could help a great deal.
Let's say China's cooperation with African country instead of a Chinese adventure. I don't know whether that is the most appropriate term, but anyway, thank you very much, Professor.
Excuse me, I only meant it,
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you very much, Professor Douglas Yates, joining us from Paris.